Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's my weekend reading report, the action-packed program where I talk about all the exciting stuff that I read during the previous week. I read some stuff. I read some stuff this previous week. Not as much as I would like, because during this past week, a crazy thing happened. All kinds of water fell out of the sky. We got lots of rain in the San Francisco Bay Area, which just came down in torrents and caused all kinds of troubles. And I was kept really busy this past week doing real life things, which unfortunately, whenever real life stuff happens, it takes me away from the important thing, which is reading. So I didn't read quite as much as I wanted to, but I did finish one book. So in the 500 book challenge, the challenge where I'm reading 500 books I own before I'll buy any new ones, I finished book 201, and that is this book, The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Amuska Orczy, or something like that. I can never pronounce her name. But the Baroness wrote The Scarlet Pimpernel, and this book is wonderful. This gets my highest recommendation. It's fantastic. So I read this for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. This is this month's pick for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. You can get this book for free on Project Gutenberg and probably lots of other places. It's just a wonderful story full of drama and suspense, and I loved it. This is a page turner, man. I could have, if I wasn't so busy, I could have just sat down and just read the whole thing front to back without getting up for like snacks or anything. Well, I probably would have gotten 9 cups of coffee like I usually do when I read a book, but this was great, man. It's probably most often mentioned nowadays because of its connection to modern day superheroes, in that here we have a heroic character who has a secret identity, and this is probably the first time the secret identity of the useless playboy was used for the Scarlet Pimpernel, which was used later to great effect with Zorro and then with Superman. But we have a hero with a secret identity. The mysterious Scarlet Pimpernel is a guy who is saving aristocrats and other people who are in danger of being guillotined in revolutionary France. So during the French Revolution, when the revolutionaries were just killing all kinds of folks right and left with their guillotine, this guy, the Scarlet Pimpernel, and his band of agents would go into France and rescue people and their families, because of course, the families were in danger as well. It was a bloody time in France. And so we had the Scarlet Pimpernel, this heroic character, who was an Englishman. And so a lot of this takes place in England. And it's just wonderful. I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but it has great characters. The Scarlet Pimpernel is a mysterious character, and I imagine when this first came out in 1905, that the character, who the Scarlet Pimpernel was, would be a mystery, right? You wouldn't automatically, I think, guess who it was. Nowadays, you read this and you know who the Scarlet Pimpernel is right away, because we've had such a long history of dealing with superheroes and heroic characters with this particular secret identity. So it was an interesting read and just so good. I can't recommend this enough. I don't want to spoil anything in the story because it's a great story. It's wonderful. So yeah, the Scarlet Pimpernel, I sure am glad that I read this one. And yeah, read this book if you haven't read this book, because it's wonderful. So I read this. And the next book I've got to read in Roger's Cheap Old Book Club for next month is Typee, which is Herman Melville's first novel. It's either Typee or Taipei. I am not exactly sure how to pronounce it. I'm sure a lot of you do know how to pronounce that name. But that is the book that I am reading, because that is Roger's pick for next month. So, yeah, December, I'll be reading Taipei, among other things that I'll be reading. But I'm looking forward to that because Moby Dick is one of my favorite books. I think it's a great book. And I haven't read any of his other books. I've read some of his short stories, but Melville's other novels I've never really gotten to for some reason. I don't know, I'm an idiot. And so I have to get to those before I croak. So we're starting next month with Taipei. So we're reading that. I would have read more this month, like I said, if it wasn't for disasters in comics. The next thing I am reading, now that I've finished with the Scarlet Pimpernel, is I am going to get back to Varney, because Varney has been sadly neglected this past week. Sorry, Varney. He's lurking around here somewhere, I'm sure. I'm going to get back to Varney, and this is probably what I'm going to be reading for the rest of the month. I'm just going to see how far I can get in Varney. I'm halfway through. Let's see how far I can get in the next week. And so I'll talk to you about Varney next weekend and all of Varney's latest troubles. He's always causing trouble, or he's always in trouble, Varney. So one of the reasons I didn't read more is because I have been reading comics. I finished this Batman's Finest Edition, or DC Comics Finest Edition of Batman, Year 1 and Year 2. So DC Finest, their new series of trade paperbacks, which are basically DC Comics versions of Epic collections. The first one is the Batman one, and it was so great. Another book that I really, really enjoyed. Year 2, not as good as Year 1, and that was probably the only thing about this collection, is that I do have so many problems with that story, Year 2. It's not completely terrible. I actually did a whole video on Batman Year 2, which, if you're interested, you could watch it. I know everybody just loves it when I talk about comics. But there's this moment in Year 2 where it's all about how before Batman existed in Gotham, there was another vigilante who existed 20 years earlier who was a psychopath. And this vigilante returns to Gotham, and Batman has to deal with this vigilante, which is not a bad idea for a story at all. And, you know, it could have been great, but there's just these complete lapses in logic and decision-making in this story on Batman's part. I mean, there's this part in the beginning where this crazed vigilante, the Reaper, is pretty much cornered by both Batman and Commissioner Gordon with a bunch of police officers. So they have the Reaper. And if they had just worked together, the police officers and Batman, they would have caught him. And this is like in the beginning of the story, practically. But Batman screws it all up for no intelligent reason. And the Reaper gets away and kills more people. And it's all Batman's fault, because Batman is an idiot in this story. So, despite some good things in this story, like basically a sound idea for the story and some interesting artwork, and there were a couple good moments in it. It just, the complete illogic of the whole thing. But enough about that. The rest of this book is fantastic, and I highly recommend it, because you get a chance to read Batman Year 1, one of the greatest Batman stories ever, in the context of all the other stories that were being published around that time, which was right after Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's great. I read that. So after that, I didn't intend to read this, but I did start reading this, Superman, DC Finest, the First Superhero. I was going to not read this and read something else, Superman-related, Golden Age Superman-related, because I had just read these stories, a year and a half ago or something. But I picked up the book, and then I just started going through it, and before I knew it, I was reading it. So I'm rereading these stories, and they're wonderful. So I'm going to read this. My intention was, anyway, to read these as they came out, the DC Finest editions, to read them all as they came out. Comic books, of course, are included in the 500 book challenge, but epic collections and these are excluded. So this won't count for my 500 book challenge, but I want to read them anyway. So I am reading this one, and it's a lot of fun. It's Golden Age Superman, watching Superman slowly become the character that we know today is interesting. It's an interesting experience. So I'll talk more about that next week. And of course, I've been reading the Fantastic Four because I've been reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four. And I am in the 70s now. I'm in, I think, 1973 or 1974 at this point. Reading these stories in this epic collection. This is the 8th volume in the Fantastic Four epic collections. Annihilus Revealed. And it's been interesting. The Miracle Man has returned. The Miracle Man, who is a character we last saw in issue 3 of the Fantastic Four. And the stories now are being written by Jerry Conway. John Buscema is still doing a great job on the artwork. So Stan Lee has left, Roy Thomas came in, and now he's gone, and now Jerry Conway is writing the stories. Jerry Conway has some weird ideas, which is kind of welcome because Stan Lee was starting to repeat himself a bit. And the Roy Thomas stories were good, but Jerry Conway's just comes up with some crazy stuff. So that has been entertaining. But now the Miracle Man has returned from issue 3. And I have a strong feeling that Jerry Conway never read issue 3 of the Fantastic Four and probably had no access to the story, because when he recaps issue 3, he gets a lot of things wrong. And John Buscema, who's doing the artwork, also, I think, never read issue 3 of the Fantastic Four because he draws some things wrong, which you know if you've read that issue. But I imagine at this time in the 70s that issue 3 of the Fantastic Four probably hadn't been reprinted that often. It might have been reprinted in an annual somewhere. It might have been reprinted somewhere in some reprint floppy comic somewhere, but it certainly didn't have any paperback reprints. And so it's entirely possible that they might have read it at one time, but it was like years before in the early 60s when they did it. And so they just couldn't remember what was going on in the stories. But nowadays, we have access to all of those early stories. So any mistakes that they make are, they're easy to see. But I imagine most people who were reading Fantastic Four at this time never read those early issues. So I guess it didn't matter. But entertaining, very entertaining. This is a good period of the Fantastic Four right here in the 70s. So the Fantastic Four were great pretty much from the start all the way up into the 70s. And so we'll see how it goes from here. A lot of these stories I've never read, so this has been a lot of fun. And the one other thing I read this week is I had this stack of comics hanging out on the shelf back there, and I took them down, and I thought, I read the first couple issues of this maybe a year ago, 2 years ago or something. I was just going to read all of these. This was a series of Conan comic books that Marvel Comics released after Conan the Barbarian was canceled. This is Conan the Adventurer. And it only ran 14 issues. I was shocked to realize I don't have all 14. The last issue I have is issue number 10. So I'm missing the last 4 issues. I'm going to have to rectify that. But this is an interesting comic book. It was written by Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas came back to write this comic book. I'm not sure why they canceled Conan the Barbarian only to bring out Conan the Adventurer. I don't know. But it's pretty good. It's a pretty good comic book. And as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I know, Conan the Adventurer has never been reprinted in any kind of collection. I don't think Dark Horse did it. Marvel has never done it as far as I'm aware. And so I think these stories might have just been forgotten, perhaps. So maybe, Titan Comics has a license now. Maybe one of these days they will reprint these stories. I don't know. Maybe. This is an embossed cover. This was at the time when, the 90s, 1994, when they like to do fun covers. And it's pretty interesting. So Roy Thomas writes this, and Raphael Cannon does the artwork. And let me just get to the initial double page splash page here. This is the Battle of Venarium, which has been illustrated in other places as well. But look at that. Look at that craziness with Conan right there in the center. 1990s Conan going nuts there. Now, this was the same battle that was that appeared in issue 0 of Titan Comics, Conan the Barbarian series. But that was a very different artistic approach to this battle. This is just craziness right here. It's fun. It's fun to see Roy Thomas back on Conan with this very interesting artistic style going on. And this has stories of Conan when he's just young Conan. He's a teenage Conan. And these are his very first adventures after leaving Samaria. So it's fun. It's a fun comic. And like I said, it's just kind of been forgotten, I think. So Conan the Adventurer, maybe somebody someday, somewhere, will reprint these stories. But otherwise, you have to go on eBay or something and buy all these original issues. And I guess I have to buy a few issues because, like I said, I don't have them all, which was shocking to me. I thought I did. So I read that. That's pretty much all the stuff I read. I did make a video last week, well, a couple days ago, about this book, Tarzan at Mars Core, written by Edward Hirschman. Now, there is a sequel to that video that I'll just put right here because I learned more about Edward Hirschman since that last video I made on Tarzan at Mars Core. So Hirschman, a mysterious character who wrote this Tarzan pastiche novel that my friend Troy Trade-Up ran across in half-price books and knew I had to have it and sent it to me. And so this was published at Hirschman's local copy shop. 2,000 copies of this were printed. And it's kind of a, earnest attempt to write a Tarzan novel, an earnest attempt to write a Tarzan novel. And I kind of gave Hirschman a hard time in that video, and some of the comments to that video where people were like taking me to task for being so rough on Hirschman. But I found out from the comments that Hirschman wrote another Tarzan pastiche novel that he published in the same way that came out a few years later in the early 1980s, 81 or 82. And its title is Tarzan, Jane, and Jungle Lust. Tarzan, Jane, and Jungle Lust was the other Tarzan novel that Hirschman wrote. And this was mentioned in one of the comments, and I read that. I'm like, really? That doesn't sound... I think I know what that is. I hope I'm wrong. So I looked it up, and it does exist. And I found a copy of on eBay. It's being sold for like $50 or something crazy. And yeah, printed the same way. And it was printed, I think, in 1982. And some of the pages, there were photographs, they have photographs on eBay of the book. And there were a few photographs of the pages of the book. And so I was able to read some of what was on those pages. It was difficult, but I managed. And it is a straight up Tarzan porn novel. It's Tarzan porn. So between the few years from the late 70s when he wrote this to the early 80s, I don't know what happened to Hirschman, But he went from writing a sincere effort, I think, to writing a Tarzan pastiche to just writing pervy porn, pervy Tarzan porn. Now, I don't want to be too judgy. You know, if Hirschman wants to write pervy porn, fine. I don't have to read it. He could write all the pervy porn he wants to. But did he have to drag Tarzan into it? I mean, really, what did Tarzan ever do to you, Edward? I mean, if you seem to really like Edgar Rice Burroughs and Edgar Rice Burroughs' work, so why drag Tarzan through the mud with your perviness? So interesting that he went in that direction. So yeah, more on Hirschman, the mysterious Edward Hirschman. That surprised me. I don't know why it surprised me. It probably shouldn't, but it did. So if anybody wants to spring $50 for a pervy Tarzan novel, well, there you go. It's on eBay. Don't think I'll get it. I think this is good enough for me. So that was interesting, and that's all I have to say, at least until tomorrow, when I hope to have a Mythos Monday up. I will catch you next time.